A Tale of Werewolves, Alphas, and Fated Destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The forest was dying around me, which seemed fitting considering I was fairly certain I was dying too, though the dying part wasn't what bothered me most after 2 weeks of stumbling through wilderness so thick and unforgiving that even the bravest trappers avoided it. But rather, it was the absolute certainty that no one would care when my body was finally discovered, picked clean by scavengers and left to rot among the fallen leaves and twisted roots that seemed determined to trip me at every desperate step. My legs were shaking with exhaustion that went bone deep, the kind of weariness that made every movement feel like I was dragging myself through thick mud, and my silver hair, which had always been the source of every terrible thing that had ever happened to me, hung in tangled, filthy ropes down my back, catching on branches and thorns as if the forest itself wanted to hold me in place and watch me give up completely. The pale strands that had once shimmered like moonlight on water, the hair my mother had lovingly brushed every night before the rogues came and destroyed everything, now looked like the matted fur of some cursed creature, and I suppose that's exactly what I was, what I had always been. What Damien had finally admitted I was when he stood before our entire pack and declared that he could not mate with someone whose very appearance screamed of darkness and death and unnatural things that should never have been born into this world. 2 weeks had passed since that moment, since I had stood in the ceremonial clearing wearing the white dress that had taken me months to sew by hand. Since I had watched Damien's golden eyes fill with disgust instead of love when he looked at me. Since he had spoken the words that shattered whatever foolish hope I had been clinging to for the 3 years we had courted. And in those 2 weeks, I had learned that rejection wasn't just an emotional wound, but a physical one that made my chest feel like someone had reached inside and carved out my heart with a dull knife, leaving behind a hollow space that echoed with every painful breath I managed to take. The Shadowcrest pack had wasted no time in casting me out, their relief palpable and overwhelming as they watched me gather my few belongings and walk toward the border. And I had felt every single one of their emotions, because that was my curse, my gift, my burden that I had carried since childhood without understanding what it meant. This ability to sense the feelings and intentions of every wolf around me, to know without question that not a single member of my pack would miss me, would mourn me, would even remember me once. Enough time had passed to erase the uncomfortable memory of the strange silver-haired Omega who had never quite belonged anywhere. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of deep purple and burning orange that would have been beautiful if I had possessed even a shred of energy to appreciate beauty anymore. But all I could focus on was the growing darkness and the knowledge that I had no shelter, no food beyond the few bitter roots I had managed to dig up that morning, and no real reason to keep walking, except for some stubborn instinct that refused to let me simply lie down and surrender to the cold and the hunger and the absolute certainty that this was how my pathetic story would end. My parents would have been ashamed of me for giving up so easily, I thought, as I stumbled over another root and barely caught myself against a tree trunk, its rough bark scraping against my palms and drawing thin lines of blood that I couldn't even feel through the numbness that had settled over my entire body like a heavy blanket made of despair and resignation. They had died protecting our small family unit from rogues when I was only 8 years old, died believing that I was special and precious and destined for something greater than the lonely existence I had carved out for myself. Died before they could see how wrong they had been about everything, about me, about the future they had promised would be bright and full of belonging and love from wolves who would see past my unusual appearance to the person underneath. But there was no person underneath I had come to realize during my long exile, there was only this broken thing that looked like a ghost and felt like a curse and brought death to anyone foolish enough to love her. Because my parents had died, and the few friends I had made as a child had drifted away as we grew older, and they realized that being associated with the strange pale Omega would damage their own social standing. And then Damien had rejected me so publicly and so cruelly that even now, 2 weeks later, I could still hear his voice echoing in my mind with perfect clarity as he announced that my silver hair and pale skin and violet-gray eyes were marks of darkness, signs that I was cursed by the moon goddess, or perhaps abandoned by her completely, too unnatural to be accepted as a proper mate for a wolf destined to lead the pack one day. The memory made my eyes burn with tears I refused to shed, because I had cried enough in the first 3 days after my banishment, had sobbed until my throat was raw, and my eyes were so swollen I could barely see. And I had promised myself that I was done with tears, done with grief, done with caring about anything at all, since caring had only ever brought me pain and disappointment, and the crushing weight of knowing that I would always be alone no matter how desperately I tried to belong somewhere, to someone, to anything beyond this endless cycle of rejection and isolation. Something was following me. I realized with a sudden spike of awareness that cut through my exhaustion like a blade, my empathic sense flaring to life with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat and my heart begin to pound with a fear that was primal and overwhelming and entirely justified, given that I was alone and unarmed and too weak to fight off even the smallest threat. The presence felt massive, powerful, intentional in a way that made my skin prickle with the certainty that whatever was tracking me through the darkening forest was not some random predator looking for an easy meal, but something far more dangerous, something that had been following me for hours, maybe days, hurting me in a specific direction for reasons I could not begin to understand and did not have the energy to figure out. My empathic gift, which had always been more burden than blessing, was screaming warnings at me in ways I had never experienced before, picking up on not just one presence, but multiple presences, all of them converging on my location with the coordinated precision of trained warriors rather than mindless beasts. And I knew with absolute certainty that I had somehow stumbled into something far more dangerous than simple wilderness survival. I should run, my rational mind insisted, should use whatever reserves of strength I had left to sprint through the trees and try to lose them in the gathering darkness. But my body refused to cooperate with that sensible plan, my legs trembling so badly that I could barely stand upright, let alone attempt to outrun whatever pack of wolves had decided to make me their target, for reasons I couldn't comprehend. Perhaps they were rogues? I thought wildly. Lawless wolves who hunted in the neutral territories between packlands, attacking lone travelers for sport or food, or simply because they could, because there was no one to stop them and no law to punish them for their cruelty. Or perhaps they were scouts from Shadowcrest, come to make sure I had truly left their territory and would never return to embarrass them with my cursed existence. Or perhaps, and this thought made my blood run cold with a terror that was almost paralyzing, they were something else entirely, something connected to the old stories my mother had whispered to me before she died. Stories about silver-haired wolves and ancient prophecies and destinies that were written in the stars before we were ever born into this cruel and unforgiving world. The presence behind me suddenly surged closer, close enough that I could feel the displacement of air and hear the soft rustle of leaves, and I made a decision born entirely of panic and desperation, breaking into a stumbling run that was barely faster than a walk, my vision blurring with exhaustion and fear as I crashed through underbrush that tore at my already ragged clothes and left fresh scratches on my exposed skin. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care, only knew that I had to move, had to keep putting distance between myself and whatever was hunting me, even though some deep part of my consciousness understood that it was futile, that I was being herded exactly where they wanted me to go, that this had all been planned, with a precision that spoke of intelligence and purpose rather than random chance or bad luck. My empathic sense was going haywire now, overwhelmed by the sheer number of presences surrounding me, each one distinct and powerful in ways that made my inadequate Omega instincts scream at me to submit, to stop running, to accept whatever fate they had planned for me, because fighting was pointless when you were outmatched in every conceivable way. The trees opened up without warning, and I found myself stumbling into a clearing, bathed in the last rays of dying sunlight, my momentum carrying me several steps forward before my exhausted legs finally gave out completely, and I fell to my knees in the center of what felt like a perfectly circular space that had been deliberately created rather than naturally occurring. My breath came in ragged gasps that sounded obscenely loud in the sudden silence, my silver hair falling forward to curtain my face as I knelt there on the cold ground, too tired to stand, too broken to care what happened next. My body finally surrendering to the inevitable end that I had been running from for 2 weeks, without really understanding why I bothered when there was nothing left to live for, and no one who would mourn my passing. The empathic presences that had been following me stopped at the edge of the clearing, hidden in the shadows of the surrounding trees, and I could feel them there, watching, waiting, evaluating me in ways that made my skin crawl with awareness, and something else, something I couldn't quite name because it wasn't hostile exactly, but rather felt like anticipation, like they had been searching for something specific and had finally found it, and that thought was somehow more terrifying than the idea of them simply wanting to kill me. I raised my head slowly, forcing my violet-gray eyes to focus through the exhaustion and fear, and what I saw made my heart stop beating for several long seconds before it resumed with painful, irregular thuds that echoed through my entire body. Wolves, massive and magnificent, were emerging from the tree line in perfect synchronization, their movements coordinated with the precision of elite warriors rather than random predators, and there were 12 of them, I counted numbly. 12 enormous wolves in various colors, from midnight black to silver gray to rich brown, each one easily twice the size of a normal wolf and radiating power that made my Omega instincts scream at me to bare my throat in submission. They formed a perfect circle around me, their intelligent eyes fixed on my kneeling form with an intensity that felt like physical pressure, and I realized with a strange detachment that I was not afraid of dying anymore. Not really, because whatever these wolves wanted from me, whatever purpose I served in their plans, it had to be more meaningful than simply freezing to death alone in the wilderness, rejected and forgotten by everyone who had ever known my cursed name. "I don't know what you want," I said, my voice coming out hoarse and broken from disuse and dehydration, the words sounding absurdly formal given the circumstances. "But I have nothing to offer you, no pack to ransom me back to, no family to mourn my death, no value to anyone in this world or any other." The admission hung in the air between us, painfully honest in a way that probably would have embarrassed me if I had possessed enough energy to care about dignity anymore, and I watched as the wolves exchanged glances with each other, communicating in ways I couldn't quite perceive, but could feel through my empathic sense, a complex web of motions and intentions that suggested this was not at all what they had expected to find. My silver hair caught the last rays of dying sunlight, probably making me look even more like the cursed creature Damien had proclaimed me to be, and I found myself touching one of the tangled strands with fingers that trembled from weakness, and remembered painfully how my mother used to say that silver hair was a blessing from the moon goddess, a mark of special favor that appeared only once every few generations in certain bloodlines. But my mother had been wrong about so many things, had died believing I was special when I was really just broken and cursed and destined to die alone among strangers who probably couldn't even understand the words I was speaking. The circle of wolves sat in perfect unison, a gesture that was clearly deliberate and seemed designed to communicate something important, though I was too exhausted and too defeated to puzzle out what it might mean. And then the forest behind them stirred with a new presence, one that made every other empathic signature I had ever felt seem insignificant by comparison. A power so vast and overwhelming that it felt like standing too close to a raging fire or trying to stare directly into the sun. Footsteps approached through the darkness, measured and deliberate, and I watched with numb fascination as a figure emerged from the shadows between the trees, taking form in the dying light, and my breath caught in my throat when I saw him clearly for the first time, saw the silver hair that fell to his shoulders and caught the fading sunlight exactly the way mine did, saw the powerful build and commanding presence that marked him as an alpha of extraordinary power, saw the silver blue eyes that fixed on me with an intensity that made my entire body go still with something that was not quite fear, but was equally overwhelming and impossible to name. "You're wrong, Omega," he said, his voice deep and rich and carrying a weight of authority that made my wolf instincts respond in ways they never had to anyone before, not even to the alphas who had ruled my former pack. "You have more value than you could possibly understand, and I've been searching every territory in the northern kingdoms for 3 months trying to find you, trying to find the one wolf whose silver hair matches mine and whose empathic gift mirrors the prophecy my mother spoke before she died. And now that I've finally found you, now that you're here in front of me looking like you've given up on everything, including your own life, I need you to understand something absolutely critical before you make any decisions about what happens next." He took a step closer, still keeping enough distance that I didn't feel trapped, but close enough that I could see the exhaustion in his eyes that mirrored my own, could sense through my empathic gift that he was not lying, that every word he spoke came from a place of desperate sincerity that was almost painful to witness. "Your silver hair is not a curse, Celine Ashwood. And yes, I know your name because I've been tracking your movements since you were cast out of Shadowcrest Pack, since the fool who rejected you proved himself unworthy of the gift the moon goddess tried to give him. And I'm here to offer you something that no one else in your entire life has ever offered, something that terrifies me almost as much as it clearly terrifies you, but something that I believe, with every fiber of my being, is absolutely true and destined and right in ways that transcend our individual wants or fears." My mind was reeling, trying to process his words, while my empathic sense was overwhelmed by the sheer force of his emotions, the hope and fear and longing that radiated from him in waves that crashed over me like a physical force, and I opened my mouth to respond, to ask who he was and what he wanted, and why he had been searching for me when I was nobody, nothing, just a cursed omega that even her own pack had thrown away like garbage. But before I could form the words, before I could demand explanations for impossible things like prophecies and searching and value that I supposedly possessed, my exhausted body finally reached its absolute limit. My vision tunneling to a narrow point of light as darkness rushed in from all sides, and the last thing I felt before consciousness abandoned me completely was strong arms catching me before I hit the ground, and a voice saying something that sounded impossible and wonderful and terrifying. Words that followed me down into the darkness like a lifeline I was almost afraid to grasp, because grasping it would mean hoping again, and hope was the most dangerous thing of all. Waking up was a gradual process that felt like swimming through thick honey toward a distant light, my consciousness returning in fragments and pieces that didn't quite fit together into a coherent picture, and the first thing I became aware of was warmth, genuine, comfortable warmth that I hadn't felt in what seemed like years, rather than just the 2 weeks I had spent stumbling through the wilderness, eating roots and drinking from questionable streams, and slowly accepting that I was going to die alone and unmourned in the forest. The second thing I noticed was softness beneath me, actual furs and blankets instead of the cold, hard ground I had become accustomed to. And the third thing, which made panic surge through my exhausted body like lightning through water, was the presence of multiple wolves nearby, their empathic signatures pressing against my awareness with an intensity that made my eyes fly open, even though my body protested the sudden movement with aches that seemed to emanate from every muscle and bone I possessed. I sat up too quickly, my vision swimming and my head spinning with the kind of dizziness that came from prolonged hunger and dehydration, and found myself in what appeared to be a well-organized military camp, complete with multiple tents arranged in a defensive circle around a central fire that crackled and popped as it consumed carefully arranged logs, sending sparks spiraling up into the night sky that was now fully dark and scattered with more stars than I had ever seen in my entire life. The wolves I had seen in the clearing, or at least most of them, were scattered around the camp in human form now, going about various tasks with the kind of efficient coordination that spoke of years of training and working together. And I watched them with growing confusion and wariness as I tried to figure out what exactly was happening and why I was still alive, when logic dictated that I should have been killed or at least abandoned once I passed out so dramatically in that clearing. A female warrior with short dark hair and a scar across her left cheek noticed my movement and approached with a bowl of something that smelled like soup. Her expression carefully neutral in a way that suggested she had been instructed to be gentle with the strange Omega who had collapsed in front of her king, and she held out the bowl with a gesture that was not quite friendly, but not hostile either, somewhere in that awkward middle ground of professional courtesy that military types seem to specialize in when dealing with civilians they didn't quite know how to categorize. "You need to eat something before you try to move around," she said, her voice gruff but not unkind, carrying the authority of someone who was used to giving orders and having them obeyed without question. And I stared at the bowl for a long moment, my stomach cramping with hunger that I had been trying to ignore for days, but my mind screaming warnings about accepting food from strangers, about owing debts to people whose motivations I didn't understand, about the dangers of letting my guard down even for a moment when the world had proven time and time again that trusting others only led to pain and disappointment. "No one poisoned it, if that's what you're worried about," the female warrior continued, a hint of exasperation creeping into her tone. "And the Alpha King specifically instructed us to make sure you ate and drank enough to recover your strength before he attempts any serious conversations with you. So you're doing both of us a favor by just taking the damn bowl and eating before you collapse again and make everyone panic about whether we're going to lose you before you even understand what's happening here." The mention of the Alpha King made my eyes dart around the camp, searching for the silver-haired male who had spoken to me in the clearing before I lost consciousness, and I found him sitting on the opposite side of the fire. His posture relaxed, but his silver-blue eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin prickle with awareness, and something else. Something that felt disturbingly like recognition, even though I had never seen him before in my entire life, and had no logical reason to feel anything toward him except confusion and wariness. He made no move to approach me, seemingly content to watch from a distance while I processed my situation and decided whether or not to accept the offered food. And there was something about his patience, about the way he was giving me space to make my own decisions without pressure or demands, that made my defensive walls crack just slightly, just enough to let a tiny sliver of hope creep in, despite all my best efforts to remain cynical and guarded against further disappointment. I took the bowl from the female warrior with trembling hands that betrayed my weakness more than I would have liked, bringing it to my lips and drinking the warm broth that tasted like heaven after days of bitter roots and questionable stream water. Feeling the warmth spread through my body and ease some of the cramping in my empty stomach, though I forced myself to drink slowly despite my body's demands to gulp it down as quickly as possible, knowing from past experience that eating too quickly after prolonged hunger would only make me sick and miserable. "My name is Kira Frostborn," the female warrior said, settling down nearby with her own bowl of food, apparently deciding that I needed some kind of companion while I recovered rather than being left alone to spiral into panic and confusion. "And before you ask, yes, we are the Alpha King's elite guard. And no, we're not going to hurt you or force you to do anything against your will. Though I'll admit, we're all intensely curious about what makes you so special that Theron has been searching for you for 3 months and driving us all half mad with his determination to cover every territory until he found the silver-haired Omega his mother prophesied about before she died." The casual way she dropped this information, as if it was common knowledge that shouldn't surprise me, made my mind reel with questions that tumbled over each other in my exhaustion-fogged brain. Questions about prophecies and searching, and mothers who apparently had visions about futures that involved strange Omegas with cursed silver hair. But I couldn't form any of those questions into coherent words, because my mouth was full of soup, and my thoughts were moving too slowly to keep up with the implications of what Kira was telling me. I managed to finish the entire bowl of soup, my body grateful for the nourishment, even as my mind continued to spin with confusion and disbelief, and Kira took the empty bowl from me with a satisfied nod, replacing it with a water skin that sloshed with fresh water, clearly determined to make sure I was properly hydrated before allowing any serious conversations to take place. "The king will want to talk to you soon," Kira said, her tone gentling slightly, as she seemed to recognize the overwhelm that must have been written all over my face. "But he's giving you time to recover a bit first, because apparently his mother warned him that empaths need time to process big emotional events or something like that, and finding out that you're part of some ancient prophecy definitely counts as a big emotional event, especially for someone who looks like they've been through absolute hell for the past few weeks." The sympathy in her voice was unexpected, and somehow more dangerous than hostility would have been, because sympathy made my carefully constructed walls want to crumble completely, made me want to break down and sob out every terrible thing that had happened to me since Damien's rejection. But I forced myself to maintain composure, to keep breathing steadily and evenly, to not give in to the weakness that came with accepting comfort from strangers who probably had their own agendas and motivations that had nothing to do with actually caring about my well-being. The silver-haired male, Theron, according to Kira, finally stood and made his way around the fire toward where I sat, wrapped in borrowed furs, and trying desperately to make sense of a situation that felt increasingly surreal with every passing moment. And I watched him approach with my empathic sense fully extended, trying to read his intentions and emotions, trying to find the deception or manipulation that surely had to be lurking beneath his apparent sincerity. But all I could sense from him was a complex mixture of hope and fear and determination and loneliness that resonated with my own emotions in ways that were deeply uncomfortable, as if we were two instruments tuned to the same frequency, and I had to resist the urge to close off my empathic gift completely because the connection I felt building between us terrified me in ways that physical danger never could. He sat down a respectful distance away, close enough to talk without shouting, but far enough that I didn't feel trapped or cornered, and he studied my face with an intensity that made me want to look away, but somehow held my gaze captive, his silver blue eyes seeming to see straight through all my defensive walls to the broken, desperate creature hiding underneath. "I'm going to tell you a story," he said, his voice pitched low and intimate as if we were the only two people in the camp, despite being surrounded by his elite guard. "And I need you to do something that I know will be difficult given everything you've been through. But I need you to just listen, to hear me out completely before you make any decisions about whether to believe me or to run away as fast as your legs will carry you. Because what I'm about to tell you will sound impossible and probably insane, but I swear on my parents' graves and on my position as Alpha King and on everything I hold sacred that every word I speak is the absolute truth as I understand it." He paused, giving me time to process his words and to nod my reluctant agreement. And then he began speaking in a voice that carried the weight of years of loneliness and searching, telling me about his mother, who had been an empath like me, who had possessed the ability to see glimpses of possible futures and had spent her entire life trying to guide her son toward the destiny she believed the moon goddess had planned for him. He told me about the night his parents were assassinated by rival pacts seeking to take advantage of political instability, about being 19 years old and suddenly responsible for ruling the largest territory in the northern kingdoms, about spending 9 years trying to be the leader his people needed while slowly dying inside from loneliness and isolation because everyone wanted the Alpha King, but no one wanted Theron the person. He told me about the prophecy his mother had shared with him weeks before her death, about how she had seen visions of a silver-haired Omega with empathic gifts who would be his perfect match, his true mate, the one person who could stand beside him as an equal rather than beneath him as a subject, and how she had described this Omega in such specific detail that he would recognize her immediately when he finally found her, would know her by her violet-gray eyes and her silver hair and her deep capacity for compassion despite being wounded by the world's cruelty. He told me about spending 5 years searching casually, meeting countless Omegas who were beautiful and accomplished and eager to be queen, but who made him feel nothing except a deepening sense that he would never find the connection his mother had promised. And then 3 months ago, receiving word that a silver-haired Omega had been cast out of Shadowcrest Pack, and immediately mobilizing his elite guard to search every inch of neutral territory until they found her, found me, found the one person who might actually see him as something more than a crown and a title. The story poured out of him like he had been holding it in for years, waiting for someone who would understand, and I listened with growing disbelief and unwilling fascination, my empathic sense confirming that he believed every word he was saying, that there was no deception or manipulation in his intentions, only desperate hope and fear of rejection, and a loneliness that mirrored my own so perfectly that it made my chest ache with recognition. "Your silver hair isn't a curse, Celine," he said, using my name with a familiarity that should have felt presumptuous but somehow felt right, as if he had earned the privilege through months of searching and hoping and refusing to give up. It's a mark of the moon goddess's favor, a sign that appears once every few generations in wolves who possess empathic gifts strong enough to change the course of kingdoms, and the fact that we both carry this mark means something. Means that we're supposed to find each other, supposed to help each other, supposed to be something together that we could never be apart. His words hung in the air between us, weighted with significance and promise and the terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't actually cursed, wasn't actually worthless, wasn't actually destined to die alone and unmourned in the wilderness. "I don't believe in fairy tales," I heard myself saying, my voice rough with emotions I couldn't quite name. "And I especially don't believe in prophecies or destiny, or the idea that the moon goddess has any particular interest in someone like me, someone who was rejected by her own pack and cast out like garbage and spent 2 weeks convinced that dying alone was exactly what she deserved." The bitterness in my tone was impossible to hide. Years of accumulated pain and rejection coloring every word, and I saw him flinch slightly, as if my pain was somehow causing him physical discomfort, which made sense if his mother had truly been an empath and had passed some degree of that sensitivity to her son. "But even if I wanted to believe you," I continued, unable to stop the words from pouring out now that I had started speaking. "Even if some part of me wants desperately to accept that there might be a reason for all the suffering and loneliness and rejection, I have no idea what you expect from me, what role I'm supposed to play in your prophecy. What happens if I can't be whatever it is you need me to be? Because I'm broken, Theron. I'm so fundamentally broken that I don't know if all your mother's visions and all your searching and all your hope can possibly be enough to fix what's wrong with me." He moved then, closing the distance between us faster than I could track. And suddenly, he was right there in front of me, close enough that I could see the silver flecks in his blue eyes and smell the scent of pine and winter that clung to him. And his hands came up to frame my face with a gentleness that made tears prick at my eyes, despite my determination not to cry anymore. "You're not broken," he said with such fierce conviction that I almost believed him. "You're wounded, and there's a difference, a crucial difference that the wolves who hurt you either couldn't see or didn't care to acknowledge, because broken things can't be fixed, but wounded things can heal given time and safety, and people who actually give a damn whether they live or die." His thumbs brushed away tears I hadn't realized were falling, his touch careful and reverent, as if I was something precious rather than cursed, and my empathic sense was overwhelmed by the sheer force of his emotions, the protectiveness and desire and genuine care that radiated from him in waves that crashed over my defenses and threatened to sweep away every reason I had convinced myself that accepting help was dangerous. "I'm not asking you to mate with me immediately," he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, intimate and intense in ways that made my heart race and my wolf instincts surge with interest despite my conscious mind's protests. "I'm not asking you to accept some prophecy you had no part in creating, and I'm definitely not asking you to trust me just because I claim we're destined or fated, or whatever other word you want to use for two people who were meant to find each other in this vast and lonely world." His hands slipped from my face to take my hands in his fingers threading through mine with a rightness that terrified me, and he continued speaking with an urgency that suggested he was afraid I might bolt at any moment and disappear back into the wilderness before he could convince me to stay. "What I'm asking, what I'm begging you to consider, is giving yourself a chance to heal To learn about your empathic gift from someone who understands it because my mother possessed the same ability. To discover that being different isn't the same thing as being cursed. And maybe, if you're willing, to get to know me as a person rather than as some prophesied mate or alpha king or any other title that doesn't really capture who I actually am beneath all the responsibility and loneliness. His words were working their way past my defenses, despite my best efforts to maintain my walls, and I found myself squeezing his hands rather than pulling away, found myself meeting his eyes rather than looking down in submission, found myself considering the impossible possibility that maybe running away wasn't actually my only option, that maybe there was another path forward that didn't involve dying alone in the wilderness or returning to Shadowcrest Pack to beg for scraps of acceptance from wolves who had never wanted me in the first place. "There's a healer," Theron said, sensing my hesitation and capitalizing on it with the strategic thinking of someone who had spent years leading armies and negotiating treaties. "An old woman named Ilara Moonshadow, who lives 3 days' journey from here in neutral territory. And she's silver-haired like us, ancient and wise, and possessing knowledge about empathic gifts that has been passed down through generations of her family. And I was planning to bring you to her regardless of whether you decided to accept me as your mate. Because you deserve to understand your gift, to learn how to control it and use it, and stop being overwhelmed by everyone else's emotions all the time." The offer was tempting, more tempting than I wanted to admit, because he was right about one thing. My empathic ability had always felt more like a burden than a gift, had always made me feel too much, and sense too much, and know things about people that I had no business knowing, and the idea of learning to control it, to shield myself when necessary and extend my awareness when useful, was appealing in ways that had nothing to do with prophecies or mate bonds or any of the other complications he had introduced into my already chaotic life. "And if I say no?" I asked, needing to know that I actually had a choice rather than just the illusion of choice that powerful people often gave to those they considered beneath them, needing to confirm that he meant what he said about not forcing me into anything against my will. Because I had learned through bitter experience that words were cheap and promises were easily broken when someone decided that their wants were more important than your autonomy. "Then we escort you safely to wherever you want to go," Theron said without hesitation, his empathic signature radiating nothing but sincerity. "We make sure you have supplies and protection and enough resources to start over somewhere far from Shadowcrest and far from me, if that's what you truly want. And you never see me again, except maybe in passing at Interpack gatherings. Though I'll admit that particular outcome would destroy me in ways I'm not entirely prepared to handle, given how long I've been searching for you, and how perfectly you match every detail my mother described in her visions." The admission was raw and honest, and made something in my chest crack open despite my best efforts to remain detached and skeptical, because he was making himself vulnerable in ways that alphas rarely did, was showing me his fears and hopes and weaknesses, as if trusting that I wouldn't use them against him, and my wounded heart responded to that vulnerability in ways my rational mind insisted were dangerous and foolish. I opened my mouth to respond, to tell him that I needed time to think, or to ask more questions about this mysterious healer, or to demand additional details about his mother's prophecy, and what exactly it claimed would happen when two silver-haired empaths finally found each other. But before I could form the words, before I could voice any of the 1,000 concerns swirling through my exhausted mind, Kira suddenly appeared at Theron's shoulder with an expression of alarm that made every wolf in the camp go instantly still and alert. "My king," she said, her voice tight with tension. "We have a situation at the perimeter that requires your immediate attention, and you're not going to like it at all, because it appears that Shadowcrest Pack has somehow tracked us down, and their alpha is demanding an audience with you, claiming that the Omega you're harboring is stolen property that needs to be returned to her rightful pack for proper judgment and punishment. The words hit me like physical blows, each one landing with devastating accuracy, and I felt the blood drain from my face as the implications crashed over me in waves of panic and despair, because of course they had come after me. Of course they couldn't simply let me go and forget I existed. Of course, Alpha Blackthorn had decided that having his pack's cast-off Omega taken in by the Alpha King himself was somehow an insult that needed to be addressed publicly and dramatically. Theron's entire demeanor changed in an instant, his relaxed posture transforming into something deadly and dangerous, his alpha presence flooding the camp with enough power to make every wolf except me immediately bare their throats in submission. And when he spoke, his voice carried a cold fury that made even Kira take a step back, despite being one of his most trusted guards. Tell Alpha Blackthorn that he has exactly 1 minute to leave our territory, before I forget that I'm supposed to be a civilized ruler and simply tear his throat out for daring to call any wolf my property, let alone one that his pack threw away like garbage and left to die in the wilderness. And if Damien is with him, if that coward who rejected his mate is standing there demanding her return, then tell him that I'll give him the fight he clearly wants, except it won't be the kind of formal challenge he's expecting, but rather the kind of brutal lesson that leaves permanent reminders about the consequences of treating empathic gifted Omegas like they're worthless. His words should have frightened me, should have made me worry about becoming the cause of interpack violence, but instead, I felt something warm and fierce bloom in my chest, something that felt disturbingly like hope, mixed with gratitude, mixed with the first stirrings of attraction toward this silver-haired alpha, who was willing to go to war over someone he had known for less than a day, someone that the entire world had told him was cursed and worthless and not worth the effort of saving. "Wait," I said, my voice coming out stronger than I expected, despite the fear churning in my stomach. And Theron turned to look at me with eyes that were more wolf than human, his protective instincts clearly running at full strength, and I knew with absolute certainty that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just my immediate future, but potentially the course of my entire life, because I could either hide behind Theron and let him handle the confrontation with my former pack, or I could stand up and face them myself, could prove to everyone, including myself, that I was more than just a cursed Omega who needed constant rescuing, could show them exactly what the moon goddess's blessing looked like when it finally decided to stop hiding behind walls of fear and self-doubt. "I want to face them," I said, making a decision that terrified me even as it felt absolutely right. "I want to face Alpha Blackthorn and Damien and anyone else who came here expecting to drag me back to Shadowcrest in chains, because they need to understand that I'm not their property and never was. And more importantly, I need to understand whether I have any courage left in me at all, or if rejection and exile managed to break something fundamental in my spirit that can never be recovered." The walk from the camp to the perimeter where Alpha Blackthorn and his warriors waited felt like the longest journey of my entire life, even though it probably only took 5 minutes at most, and every step forward was a conscious choice to not turn around and hide behind Theron's protection, to not let fear and old shame dictate my actions anymore, to not prove that Damien and his father and every other wolf who had ever called me cursed was somehow right about my fundamental worthlessness. Theron walked beside me rather than in front of me, a subtle but significant positioning that announced to everyone watching that he considered me his equal rather than his subordinate. And I could feel his alpha presence radiating protectively around me like a shield, even though he was carefully not touching me, not trying to claim ownership or control, just offering his strength as a support I could lean on if I chose to, but didn't have to accept if I preferred to stand alone. Kira and the other elite guards formed a loose circle around us, their postures alert and ready for violence but not actively aggressive, and I realized with a strange clarity that this entire display was choreographed to send a very specific message about my value and status, about the fact that the Alpha King himself had mobilized his most elite warriors to search for me, and was now willing to start a territorial dispute rather than hand me back to the pack that had thrown me away like garbage. We emerged from the tree line into a cleared area that served as neutral ground between territories, and I saw them immediately, saw the wolves from Shadowcrest Pack arranged in what was clearly meant to be an intimidating formation, and standing at the front was Alpha Blackthorn with his golden hair and powerful build and expression of righteous authority that had probably worked on countless wolves over the years, but somehow seemed diminished and petty when compared to Theron's quiet confidence and genuine power. Damien stood slightly behind his father, his golden eyes finding me instantly and widening with something that might have been shock or regret or disbelief as he took in my appearance, no longer the bedraggled and desperate Omega who had stumbled through his rejection ceremony, but someone who stood straight and clean and dressed in borrowed clothes that actually fit properly, my silver hair brushed and flowing, and catching the morning light in ways that must have reminded him of every reason he had claimed to reject me in the first place. There were perhaps 20 Shadowcrest warriors in total, all of them trying to look fierce and intimidating, but clearly unsettled by the presence of the Alpha King's elite guard, clearly uncertain about whether their alpha had made a terrible mistake by pursuing this confrontation, and I felt a surge of bitter satisfaction at their discomfort, even though I knew that satisfaction was petty and unhelpful, and probably not the response of someone who was supposed to be growing beyond her past wounds. "Alpha King Theron," Blackthorn said, his voice carrying across the clearing with practiced authority, apparently deciding to ignore me completely and address himself to the male he considered the real decision-maker in this situation. "I apologize for the intrusion into neutral territory, but I felt it necessary to address a situation that affects both our packs and could potentially cause diplomatic complications if not handled properly, and according to established pack law regarding the treatment of cast-out wolves." His formal language and careful phrasing suggested he had been practicing this speech, had convinced himself that he had some kind of legitimate claim or legal standing, and I felt Theron tense beside me, felt his alpha presence surge with barely controlled fury at the implication that I was some kind of disputed property that needed to be divided according to pack law, rather than a person with autonomy and rights, and the ability to make my own decisions about where I wanted to be and who I wanted to be with. "You have 30 seconds to explain why I shouldn't challenge you right here for daring to call any wolf your property," Theron said, his voice deadly quiet and far more terrifying than if he had shouted. "And you should know before you speak that the Omega standing beside me is not some random refugee I picked up out of pity, but rather the silver-haired empath that ancient prophecy declared would be my true mate, and that I have been searching for her specifically for 3 months, and that I found her half dead in the wilderness after your pack cast her out and left her to die alone, so choose your next words very carefully, because I am not feeling particularly diplomatic or forgiving at this moment." The statement hung in the air like a physical thing, and I watched as Blackthorn's expression shifted from confident authority to barely concealed alarm as he processed what Theron had just announced publicly in front of witnesses from both packs, the fact that the Alpha King had claimed me as his prophesied mate, which meant that any insult to me was an insult to him personally, and to his entire bloodline, and to the legitimacy of his rule. Damien stepped forward then, his golden eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl with remembered humiliation. And when he spoke, his voice carried a desperate quality that suggested he was just now understanding the magnitude of what he had thrown away when he rejected me in front of our entire pack. "Celine," he said, using my name with a familiarity he had lost all rights to. "Surely you understand that there's been a terrible mistake, that if I had known about your connection to the Alpha King or about any prophecy involving your silver hair, I would never have rejected. You would never have spoken those cruel words during the ceremony, and I'm here now to formally rescind that rejection and offer to complete our mating bond as we had originally planned, because clearly the moon goddess intended for us to be together, and I was too blind to see the signs she was sending." His words should have filled me with triumph or satisfaction, should have given me some kind of vindication after weeks of believing that my rejection proved my fundamental unworthiness. But instead, all I felt was a cold, clear anger that burned away the last remnants of shame and self-doubt that had been weighing me down since the moment he had declared me cursed in front of everyone I had ever known. "No," I said, the single word cutting through the morning air with surprising force, and I took a step forward away from Theron's protective presence, needing to do this on my own, needing to prove to myself more than anyone else that I could stand up to the wolves who had hurt me without hiding behind someone stronger. "You don't get to do this, Damien. You don't get to reject me publicly and cruelly when you thought I was worthless, and then come crawling back the moment you realize that I might actually have value to someone more powerful than you. Because that's not love or mate bonds or anything that the moon goddess would bless. That's just politics and social climbing, and the desperate scrambling of someone who finally understands that he made a catastrophic error in judgment, but doesn't actually care about the person he hurt, only about the opportunities he lost." My voice was shaking slightly but growing stronger with each word, years of accumulated pain and anger finally finding an outlet, and I saw him flinch as my words hit their target, saw his carefully constructed apology crumble in the face of my refusal to play along with his attempt to rewrite history. "The rejection stands," I continued, gaining momentum now, my empathic sense picking up on the emotions of everyone present and using that information to fuel my courage. "And more than that, I reject you right back, Damien Blackthorn. I reject your shallow affection that was never actually based on who I am as a person, but only on how you thought I could serve your ambitions. I reject your conditional acceptance that disappeared the moment you decided my appearance was more important than my character. And I reject any possibility of a future together, because you've shown me exactly who you are when things get difficult. And what you are is a coward who breaks people and then gets angry when they won't let themselves be broken twice." The words felt like liberation, like finally releasing poison that had been festering inside me for weeks, and I watched with grim satisfaction as Damien's face flushed with anger and embarrassment, watched as the Shadowcrest warriors shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting their mission to retrieve a supposedly worthless Omega to turn into a public humiliation of their future Alpha. Alpha Blackthorn stepped forward then, his expression darkening with anger that he was probably used to using to intimidate lesser wolves into submission, and he opened his mouth to say something that was undoubtedly going to be threatening or dismissive, or designed to put me back in what he considered my proper place as a lowly Omega with no rights or authority. But before he could speak, before he could reduce me back to the frightened, rejected wolf I had been when I fled from his territory, Theron moved with the supernatural speed that only the most powerful alphas possessed, crossing the distance between us and placing himself between me and Blackthorn with a grace that was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority that came from ruling the largest territory in the northern kingdoms. "You will not speak to her," he said, each word dropping like stones into still water, creating ripples of power that made every wolf present, except me, drop their eyes in submission. "You will not address her. You will not look at her. You will not even think about her, because she is mine now, not as property, but as my chosen mate, as the Luna who will stand beside me and help me rule, as the silver-haired empath that prophecy declared would be my perfect match. And if you have any problems with that arrangement, if you think you have any claim or right or authority to challenge my decision, then step forward right now and we will settle this the old way, with tooth and claw, and the kind of violence that reminds everyone why the strongest wolves lead and the weak wolves follow." The challenge hung in the air, brutal and uncompromising, and I watched as Blackthorn's face went pale as he realized that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation, had somehow convinced himself that he could come here and demand the return of a wolf he had thrown away, and the Alpha King would just hand me over to avoid diplomatic complications, completely failing to understand that Theron had been searching for me specifically and would burn down entire territories rather than let anyone take me away from him. "I see," Blackthorn said finally, his voice tight with suppressed rage and humiliation. "Then I apologize for the intrusion and any misunderstanding about the Omega's status, and Shadowcrest Pack withdraws any claims we might have had to her presence or her service, and we wish you both well in your future together." The words were clearly painful for him to speak, each one dragged out like pulling teeth, and I knew without using my empathic sense that he was already planning how to spin this story back in his territory, how to make it seem like he had graciously released me to fulfill some greater destiny, rather than admitting that he had thrown away something precious and was now too weak to take it back. Damien looked like he wanted to say something else. Wanted to make one more attempt to explain or apologize or somehow salvage his dignity from this disaster of his own making, but his father grabbed his arm and pulled him back toward the tree line, clearly recognizing that they had already lost this confrontation and that staying longer would only make things worse. The Shadowcrest wolves retreated in a formation that tried to look orderly and dignified, but mostly just looked like the hasty escape it actually was, and I watched them go with emotions that were far too complicated to untangle in the moment. A mixture of triumph and sadness, and relief and anger, all swirling together in ways that made my chest feel tight and my eyes burn with tears I absolutely refused to shed in front of anyone, even in front of Theron, who had just defended my honor more fiercely than anyone had ever defended anything about me in my entire life. When they were finally gone, disappearing into the forest that had nearly killed me just days ago, Theron turned to face me with an expression that was equal parts concern and pride, and something else, something that looked disturbingly like the kind of deep affection that developed between true mates who had chosen each other freely rather than being forced together by circumstance or obligation. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle now that the threat had passed. And I realized that I was shaking slightly, adrenaline and emotion catching up with me now that I no longer needed to maintain my brave facade. And without thinking about it, I stepped forward into his space and let him wrap his arms around me in an embrace that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering lost and alone. "I'm better than all right," I said against his chest, my voice muffled but sincere. "I'm free, truly free for the first time in my entire life, because I just faced down everyone who ever made me feel worthless and told them exactly what they could do with their rejection and their conditional acceptance and their attempts to control me." He held me tighter, one hand coming up to stroke my silver hair with a reverence that made my heart ache with the realization that someone actually valued me, actually saw me as precious rather than cursed, actually wanted to build a future with me that involved partnership rather than ownership. "We should get you to Ilara," Theron said after a long moment of just holding each other while his guards discreetly looked away and pretended to be very interested in checking the perimeter. "You need proper training in your empathic gifts, and you need time to heal from everything Shadowcrest put you through. And then, if you're willing, if you decide that you want to accept the mate bond that I can feel growing stronger between us with every moment we spend together, we can start planning a future that involves something more than just running from past wounds." The journey to Ilara's cottage took 3 days as promised, and they were 3 of the most transformative days of my entire life. 3 days of learning about Theron as a person rather than just as an alpha king or a prophesied mate. 3 days of discovering that being wanted and valued felt completely different from being merely tolerated or pitied. 3 days of watching him interact with his guards and seeing the genuine respect and affection they had for him, respect that was earned through years of fair leadership rather than demanded through shows of dominance and power. We talked about everything during those 3 days, about his childhood and mine, about his parents' assassination and my parents' deaths, about the loneliness of leadership and the pain of rejection, about hopes for the future and fears about whether we were truly capable of being what each other needed. And with each conversation, I felt my defensive walls crumbling a little more, felt myself beginning to believe that maybe the prophecy was real. Maybe the moon goddess had actually marked us both in silver, so we would recognize each other when we finally met. Maybe I wasn't cursed at all, but blessed in ways I had been too wounded to recognize. Ilara turned out to be exactly what I needed, an ancient silver-haired woman with eyes that saw too much and hands that were gentle when she taught me how to shield my empathic sense from the overwhelming flood of emotions that had plagued me my entire life. How to extend my awareness deliberately rather than being constantly bombarded by everyone else's feelings. How to use my gift to heal emotional wounds the same way I had learned to heal physical ones. She told me stories about other empaths throughout history, about how rare and precious the gift was, about how silver hair had always marked those chosen by the moon goddess for special purposes, about how Theron's mother had been her student once and had seen visions of me long before I was born, had known that her son would find his perfect match in a wounded Omega with silver hair and violet-gray eyes, who had learned compassion through suffering rather than through privilege. Under Ilara's patient teaching, I began to understand that my empathic ability wasn't a curse that made me too sensitive or too different, but rather a powerful tool that could help me understand people in ways that normal wolves never could help me lead beside Theron with wisdom and insight that complemented his strength and strategic thinking, could help me create a kingdom where the wounded and the different and the cast out were valued rather than discarded. 6 months after that first meeting in the forest clearing, after months of training and healing and learning to trust again, I stood beside Theron under a full moon while an entire kingdom watched us complete our mating bond in a ceremony that was part ancient tradition and part personal choice. And when he marked my neck and I felt the mate bond finally snap fully into place, it felt like every terrible thing I had ever endured had been leading me to exactly this moment, to exactly this person, to exactly this future. The bond between us was overwhelming in its intensity, our empathic gifts amplifying and enhancing each other in ways that made us almost telepathic in our understanding of each other's emotions and needs, and I finally understood what Theron's mother had meant when she prophesied that 2 silver-haired empaths would be perfect matches, would complete each other in ways that transcended normal mate bonds, would rule together with a wisdom and compassion that came from understanding hearts as well as minds. As Luna of the Northern Territories, I worked to create programs for cast-out Omegas and refugees from abusive packs, used my empathic gifts to identify wolves who needed healing or help, or just someone who saw them as valuable despite their differences. And I discovered that being different wasn't a curse at all, but rather the greatest gift the moon goddess could have given me, because it meant I understood what it felt like to be rejected and alone, and convinced of my own worthlessness, which meant I could recognize those feelings in others and help them find their way back to hope and belonging, just as Theron had helped me. Years later, when young wolves with unusual features or empathic gifts or any other quality that made them feel cursed or broken would come to me seeking guidance, I would tell them my story about being surrounded by wolves in a forest clearing and having an alpha king step out of the shadows to tell me I was valuable and precious and exactly what he had been searching for, about learning that silver hair marked those chosen for special purposes rather than those abandoned by the moon goddess, about discovering that the mate bond was real and powerful and worth every moment of suffering it took to find it. And those young wolves would leave with hope in their eyes and the understanding that being different was not a weakness, but a strength that would one day lead them to exactly where they needed to be. The prophecy had been fulfilled. 2 silver-haired empaths had found each other and united a kingdom. And every day I woke up beside Theron. I thanked the moon goddess for every rejection and every moment of loneliness and every terrible thing that had led me through that forest to that clearing where destiny waited in the form of 12 elite guards and an alpha king who had been searching for me just as desperately as I had been searching, without even knowing it, for him. And I understood finally and completely that I had never been cursed at all. I had simply been blessed in ways that took time and pain and growth to fully recognize and embrace.